Ghanaians believe that their transformation will not occur on the back of parties, but on the back of leadership. It's a question of leadership.
Well, hello there. Welcome to this week's edition of Alan Speaks Primetime Show. My name is Kwame Owusu Danso. This week we are talking governance, and we are looking at the various aspects of governance. It is important that we touch on it because you do know that without governance, all the very nice things which have been put forward by Honorable Alan Kwadwo Kyerematen will never see the light of day. And so we're going to be talking governance, but we're going to be looking at certain varied aspects of governance. We're going to, first of all, be touching on corruption and some other areas of governance. Corruption, because corruption is, the bane of the country's economy, and successive governments have not been able to address this teething challenge. Alan Kwadwo Kyerematen is promising that when he gets the opportunity, he will be able to nip it in the bud. And how he's going to do that, I'll leave him to explain that to us. Welcome again to Alan Speaks here with me, Kwame Owusu Danso. Well, thank you again for your time this week.
Thank you very much, Kwame.
So let's look at governance this week. You have beautiful ideas, brilliant ideas. You've explained them in great detail. I'm particularly excited as a young person in Ghana. At least I have some confidence that we have leaders who still think about, our aspirations, who still think about our dreams, who still think about the development and the well-being of the young people. But you do know that one of the fundamental challenges that we're facing has got to do with governance inefficiencies. And particularly, we're looking at corruption. Successive governments have tried and failed in dealing with corruption. Indeed, it has always become like a political, tool. This administration will say, "Oh, we'll deal with corruption." This other one says, "We'll deal with corruption." This one is corrupt. This one is not corrupt. The corruption perception index has skyrocketed. So clearly, there's a problem, right? What excites me is the fact that you have actually given it a greater thought, and in your policy direction, you're saying that you're going to deal with corruption. First of all, give us a general overview of your perspective in terms of governance, and then we'll move into dealing with the issue of corruption.
Thank you, Kwame. Kwame, in our previous episodes, we've had the opportunity of looking at the economy, and there's absolutely no doubt that economic progress is fundamental to the well-being of society of Ghanaians. But it is also important for us to understand that governance and the economy are two sides of the same coin.
Okay.
And the governance architecture of our country directly and indirectly affects the economy and other aspects of our society. And within this context, I'm happy you are escalating and bringing to the fore the issue of corruption.
Right.
Because corruption, to borrow your own words,
right,
it's indeed the bane of Ghanaian society. And it has been a major destabilizing factor for progress in Ghana. In fact, since independence. And the GTP under an Alan presidency is providing very robust and far-reaching fundamental policy prescriptions to deal substantively with corruption. And we are doing so based on where we believe the areas of focus ought to be. Obviously, one is leadership. And when we talk about leadership by political appointees, and not just the political appointees at the top Ghanaians believe that their transformation will not occur on the back of parties, but on the back of leadership. It's a question of leadership.
Well, hello there. Welcome to this week's edition of Alan Speaks Primetime Show. My name is Kwame Owusu Danso. This week we are talking governance, and we are looking at the various aspects of governance. It is important that we touch on it because you do know that without governance, all the very nice things which have been put forward by Honorable Alan Kyerematen will never see the light of day. And so we're going to be talking governance, but we're going to be looking at certain varied aspects of governance. We're going to, first of all, be touching on corruption and some other areas of governance. Corruption, because corruption is, the bane of the country's economy, and successive governments have not been able to address this teething challenge. Alan Kyerematen is promising that when he gets the opportunity, he will be able to nip it in the bud. And how he's going to do that, I'll leave him to explain that to us. Welcome again to Alan Speaks here with me, Kwame Owusu Danso. Well, thank you again for your time this week.
Thank you very much, Kwame.
So let's look at governance this week. You have beautiful ideas, brilliant ideas. You've explained them in great detail. I'm particularly excited as a young person in Ghana. At least I have some confidence that we have leaders who still think about, our aspirations, who still think about our dreams, who still think about the development and the well-being of the young people. But you do know that one of the fundamental challenges that we're facing has got to do with governance inefficiencies. And particularly, we're looking at corruption. Successive governments have tried and failed in dealing with corruption. Indeed, it has always become like a political, tool. This administration will say, "Oh, we'll deal with corruption." This other one says, "We'll deal with corruption." This one is corrupt. This one is not corrupt. The corruption perception index has skyrocketed. So clearly, there's a problem, right? What excites me is the fact that you have actually given it a greater thought, and in your policy direction, you're saying that you're going to deal with corruption. First of all, give us a general overview of your perspective in terms of governance, and then we'll move into dealing with the issue of corruption.
Thank you, Kwame. Kwame, in our previous episodes, we've had the opportunity of looking at the economy, and there's absolutely no doubt that economic progress is fundamental to the well-being of society of Ghanaians. But it is also important for us to understand that governance and the economy are two sides of the same coin.
Okay.
And the governance architecture of our country directly and indirectly affects the economy and other aspects of our society. And within this context, I'm happy you are escalating and bringing to the fore the issue of corruption. Right. Because corruption, to borrow your own words, right, it's indeed the bane of Ghanaian society. And it has been a major destabilizing factor for progress in Ghana. In fact, since independence. And the GTP under an Allen presidency is providing very robust and far-reaching fundamental policy prescriptions to deal substantively with corruption. And we are doing so based on where we believe the areas of focus ought to be. Obviously, one is leadership. And when we talk about leadership by political appointees, and not just the political appointees at the top of the hierarchy, but right down through the length and breadth of our political institutions. And then also right down to our public servants, our civil servants. Because unless we deal with individuals and their attitudes to corruption, no amount of preaching will help deal with it. So that's one entry point.
Okay.
The second entry point then deals with the laws and the regulations and the legislation. And I'm sure we'll get into a little bit.
Let's get into that. Let's get into that.
But let me scope for it. And then it's also the institutions that are designed to deal with corruption.
The anti-corruption institutions.
Yes. And then, of course, it's also about the citizens, the role that citizens have to play in dealing with corruption. So maybe we can start with the issue of leadership.
Leadership, yeah.
And we start with leadership because what I, as Alan Kyerematen, what I believe in is the fact that where, as a leader, you cannot commit to a personal leadership that does not tolerate any form of corruption in any form or nature, then it becomes very difficult for you to superintend over a regime that claims to be able to deal with corruption. So it starts from the top. And I say this with all pride that I've never been corrupt and I'll never be corrupt. So that provides and gives me the confidence to deal with people around me who intend or will attempt to get into corrupt practices once I become president. For me, it is very, very important.
Leadership is key.
Yes, it's key.
Yeah.
But as I said, once you show the way, then by extension, people will start feeling their way through this whole very difficult challenge of getting personal gain from using the color of your office, which corruption is about.
So clearly, we're going to run through them quickly.
Yes.
But what would you say to people who think that some of these statements are just superficial and that's just mere rhetorics, particularly owing to the fact that Nana Kwadwo is on record to have pontificated that he was not a corrupt person, that he was not going to steal the people's money. Fast forward, we know all the allegations that have been leveled against him, albeit that there's a question of whether it's been proven. But the perception is there, and a lot of people have seen several things which have been done in his government, which things have not really been dealt with properly. So how different would you be? I mean, how do we trust your words that you're not corrupt? Of course, you're not corrupt, but that when you get the opportunity to lead the people of Ghana, you're not going to superintend over corrupt practices.
Well, I think it comes back to the commitment and the political will of the individual. I mean, I cannot speak on behalf of any other political leader, but I want the people of Ghana to take me by my words, and it will become very obvious. I mean, look, if you are campaigning on the promise of zero tolerance for corruption, once you get into office, you are putting yourself up for a very serious test. And I agree with you entirely that we've had leaders, successive governments, leaders who have made the same political statements. I am asking the people of Ghana to judge me by my record in the past and what
in the present,
and what I've said about going into the future.
Okay, so you think that there are some constitutional discrepancies, some lapses, and you think that we have to have some specific isolations in respect of the corruption-related agencies or agencies that deal directly with corruption-related matters and things like that. I mean, why so and how so?
But let's even start with the laws.
Very well.
Because if you read the GTP, it says clearly that we must isolate all corruption-related provisions in existing legislation.
That's what I was referring to when I told you.
Right now, if you look at the jurisprudence or the set of laws and regulations intended or designed to deal with corruption. You have some provisions under the legislation establishing the office of the special prosecutor.
True.
But you also have YOCO that has a mandate to deal with corruption and corruption-related offenses. Then you have SHRAJ, which is another constitutional body that also seems to have functions in respect of dealing with corruption. Now, when you have all these, and of course the police, CID, they also
investigate those matters.
Yes, they investigate those matters. So the lack of coherence in terms of our laws and regulations in dealing with corruption, even the fact that we do not seem to have a consistent, I would say, definition of corruption in itself, it's a matter. So apart from the issue of personal leadership, what the GTP is saying, what an Allen presidency is committing to, is the fact that we will consolidate all the corruption-related provisions in existing legislation and consolidate them under one enabling act that will deal substantively with corruption. And within that context of an enabling act or legislation, appoint an anti-corruption czar. You know what the czar is.
Yeah.
You know, so a powerful overlord, someone who can oversee this whole regime of dealing with corruption. Now, the difference between the anti-corruption czar as envisaged and the current office of the special prosecutor is that the special prosecutor derives his prosecutorial authority from the Attorney General. And that is clear from the Constitution.
Absolutely.
That the Attorney General of Ghana is vested with all prosecutorial authority. Now, that means that the special prosecutor, in prosecuting cases of corruption, does so on the back of a delegated responsibility.
Indeed.
That obviously is a challenge. So we, or the GTP under an Allen presidency, will make sure that we rationalize and consolidate the existing legislation. I think it's a very important description. But also, it says that we will review the Procurement Act, because the Procurement Act has been a major source of corruption. We all know that. When people are bidding for government contracts, there are so many openings to have incidents of corruption. And whilst you cannot stop government procurement, what you can deal with is to make sure that the provisions of the Procurement Act do not lend themselves to corruption. And part of this effort in dealing with legislation under the Procurement Act is to abolish sole sourcing. And I know that this will be a major revolutionary step. People are going to argue that, well, we cannot abolish sole sourcing, and that there are genuine cases and instances where you would have to sole source.
I think you explained that in your revenue optimization bit.
Yes, when we did that. But as I explained to you in that episode, it is clear that it has been a major source of abuse and a source of corruption in our country. So if it is not there, it is not there. However, I also made that point during that episode, that in the event that it becomes absolutely necessary due to exigencies or one reason or the other, it is only the president who can then authorize the use of sole sourcing as a form of government contracting process. And the buck stops with the president. If he's lending his his reputation and office to be the sole individual who can authorize sole sourcing, then the buck stops with him. And I think this will, to a very large extent, deal with the matter.
What is the Anti-Corruption Citizens Charter?
Yeah, the Anti-Corruption Citizens Charter is about the fact that we, as Ghanaians, should be able to be part of this whole fight against corruption. If you read the specific proposal in the GTP, it says introduce an anti-corruption citizens charter that requires every person, as provided under Article 4.1 of the 1992 Constitution, to protect and preserve public property.
Yeah.
To protect and preserve public property and expose and combat misuse and waste of public funds and property.
Yeah.
So this citizens charter derives its strength and authority and authenticity from the Constitution. And for me, I think that it's not just about personal leadership, it's not just about the corruption legislation, it's also about the citizens living up to their responsibility to check and deal with corruption. But if that is the case, then we are also proposing that there should be an anti-corruption award scheme to encourage and to incentivize individuals who are able not just to unearth incidents of corruption, but actually pursue it relentlessly. Can you imagine if indeed there's such an award scheme and there's no act of corruption in any form or nature that will not involve individuals one way or the other. So if individuals, particularly public servants and civil servants, who have knowledge of cases of corruption, can take advantage of this award scheme, and if it is a really attractive award scheme, I have no doubt in my mind that those who need to have the courage to point out incidents of corruption will do so. At least there's a motivation and a reward scheme.
Before you get to the asset declaration amendment, are you also going to consider the possibility of removing human contact in relation to transactions? Again, I cite you Rwanda as an example. When I was in the law school in Rwanda, I do recall that I had to make some payments to the school, and I went there with cash. And then the rector said, "What do you want me to be arrested? You know, is it deliberate? Are you trying to tempt me? Do you want, you know?" So because their concept is that money, physical cash doesn't exchange hands. You don't give me cash. Go to the bank, do banker's draft, and pay me. So as much as possible, we're trying to eliminate the human contact with cash, with physical cash. There's also this, although it's not like a law per se, right? But there's this perception that anytime someone brings you cash, okay, the receiver is scared of the giver, because the receiver doesn't know whether the giver is trying to set him up. Now, the giver doesn't want to give because he doesn't know what the receiver is thinking, whether the receiver will also receive it and set him up, you know, and then, you know, so there's no corruption in Rwanda. That's essentially what I'm saying. The police officers, when a police officer stops you, you can't come down from your vehicle. You have to stay in your vehicle. The police officer will walk to you nicely and then tell you your offense. If you have to pay, they give you a mobile money code, you pay into it, and then you drive off. So as much as possible, they're trying to eliminate corruption, you know, in that regard. So are you going to also consider that as part of the things that you're going to do to addressing the challenge of corruption?
Very much so. And in some of our other episodes,
right,
the use of digitization and management information systems would clearly play a major role in this. Because the moment you reduce, you cannot totally eliminate human contact. The moment you significantly reduce the element of human influence, interference, and human contact, particularly in the delivery of government services. You are, by extension, also reducing the attraction for corruption. And it goes without saying, but this has to be mainstreamed throughout the entire public service system, because that's where digitalization becomes a means to an end, not an end in itself.
Okay. Our inability to question the source of wealth for people, for everybody, including politicians, is what, in my estimation, is also accounting for some of these things, because asset declaration right now has become a problem. I mean, people usually don't declare their assets the way they're supposed to. They don't even let us know exactly what it is they have before they get into office, and when they get into office and they're exiting, we don't even know what they have, right? But the derivative, in my view, is by reason of the fact that generally we do not even care about the sources of wealth of people in this country. Young boy, just graduates from university, does all manner of things and is able to now buy a mansion, buy Mercedes-Benz, which before now was pension car.
Yeah, a pension car. Absolutely.
So asset declaration is one of the problems that we have, and a bigger challenge we are facing in relation to dealing with corruption. How do you intend to address that? As
you rightly pointed out, asset declaration has always been a major component of our efforts to deal with corruption. But as is always the case, you would have situations where people will not accurately reflect their assets in any declaration exercise, and sometimes it's very difficult to be able to deal with that. But whichever way it is, requiring public officers to deal to declare the assets is an absolute necessity. That indeed is the starting point. And there's currently a bill that has been making the rounds between cabinet and parliament on what I think is described as conduct or code of ethics for public officers. This code of conduct for public officers bill also strengthens the asset declaration provision that already exists, and the GTP fully endorses that component of the bill. But then just declaring your asset is fine. What about if you are able to fraudulently acquire additional assets? I'm talking about fraudulently, that's using the color of your office for personal gain, which is the definition, the technical definition of corruption. Does it mean that we should wait till you are exiting from office before you declare your assets again, and we are able to determine the gap and determine whether your acquisition of additional assets is attributable to corruption or not? We cannot have the luxury of waiting for that long. So what the GTP is proposing is that in addition to declaring your assets, that would also establish a new regime of lifestyle audits. Exactly as you said, KOD, yes, we know you are hardworking, but if you display a certain lifestyle,
unexplained wealth,
which clearly points to unexplained wealth, then that becomes another mechanism for tracking and auditing your lifestyle. So we want to be able to reinforce existing mechanisms, but to introduce some of these additional ones.
How do you intend to work with civil society organizations on that?
Well, civil society organizations have always been a powerful voice in dealing with problems of the society, not just corruption, but particularly for corruption. We are proposing under the GTP that under an Allen presidency, that we will indeed support civil society organizations and other non-government institutions that are established specifically to deal with corruption. Because yes, they are non-governmental organizations, but if government appreciates the cost of corruption to our economy, then it makes a lot of sense if government can provide some resources to empower these CSOs in doing their work and their watchdog responsibilities.
I'm going for a quick break, but I want to put you on the solid view. You know, how would you score this government in the fight against corruption?
The anti-corruption index is very clear. I can't remember specifically,
no,
but
what will your figure be?
It was scored very low, because if you look at and you hear about the various incidents that have come up on the radar, this is not something that the government can be proud of. You know, and unfortunately, some of these things have occurred under a regime where the government itself continuously is propagating the gospel of anti-corruption. So the record is not good, and it makes it very difficult for the ordinary Ghanaian to really now believe in politicians. It was very bad under the NDC. It's very bad under the NDC. That is why if Ghanaians are it was bad under the NDC. It has been very bad under the MPP. And that is why a lot of Ghanaians, among other things, are looking for change. This whole drive towards a movement for change is anchored on many things, but particularly the need to have a zero tolerance regime for corruption.
Well, thank you very much. Quick break, stay with us. We'll be back shortly.
I say, you be who know me who be away. I say, the echoes of the air, so when I say, obi the coins to buy, you may. I say, the rip is a bit dry. I say, Alan Cash. I say, the this car coins upon wine. I say, and the car labash. I say, that's a blue cannibal. I say, never pie balu. I say, I'm in the bride. I say, everything I do. I say, before shine your eye. I say, before you shine your shoe. I say, well, I won't nine it. I say, you want to wear bamboo. I say, hey, I say, I say, Munjai, I say, I say, I dey come like Alan Cash. Alan Cash, plenty money for my bank. I say, for my bank. I say, I say, I say, Munjai, I say, I say, I dey come like Alan Cash.
Welcome back. This is still Alan Speaks Primetime Show. We are sitting with Honorable Alan Kwadwo Kyerematen, and we're talking about governance, and he has explained to us how he intends to deal with the almighty corruption. Now we're going to be looking at public sector reforms under the Great Transformational Plan. Can you share with us, sir, first, how you intend to address the issue relative to the public sector?
The most critical issue in respect of public sector reform is reducing the size of government.
Okay.
And I recall in one of our earlier
about
episodes,
it, that you reduce it to 40.
We talked about that. It's all about expenditure management and control. And there can be no better place to start from in dealing with expenditure control and public sector reform than reducing the size of government. Currently, we have, I believe, 100 ministers, over 100 ministers. So one would ask, for a country of the size of Ghana, do you really need 100 ministers to be doing the work of government? And I would say definitely no. The Constitution even provides some guidance in this regard. It talks about 19 cabinet positions. The only one that it specifically prescribes expressly is the appointment of an attorney general. By Constitution, you need to have an attorney general. But beyond that, you can appoint any type of minister as long as you have 19 cabinet ministers. And then the Constitution also provides that every region should have a minister.
So 16.
So you have 16 plus 19, that's 35.
35.
So where is all this 100 from? And we have said that obviously when you start consolidating some of the ministries, it will require you to have either ministers of state or deputy ministers to support them. So an island presidency is making a commitment to reduce the size of government to only 40 ministers. Only 40 ministers. And we've already given elaborate description of the areas that will be cut and where.
Can you share with us some of the areas that you're
so, for example,
right.
the Ministry of Finance and the work that the Minister of Finance does is closely linked to the work that the Minister of Industry, Minister of Trade and Industry does.
Oh, I see.
In fact, there are two sides of the same coin. One is superintending the whole policy environment for creating wealth, and the other one is superintending the exercise of distributing or deploying the country's wealth to ensure that development goes on. So the two are very closely interlinked. Any time where you have a divergence of opinion between what the Minister of Finance wants to do and what the Minister of Trade and Industry wants to do, these are the two major pillars of any economy. You have a problem. So there can be no better architecture than what the GTP is proposing, that you combine the ministries of finance, industry and trade and investment. If you go to South Korea, you go to Japan, some of the Asian countries, this is the model that they've used over the years to give them that economic power over the years. And so that's one of the proposals. The other one that comes to mind is infrastructure. Road is infrastructure, rail is infrastructure, ports is infrastructure, energy is infrastructure. But why is it that all these infrastructure related activities find themselves in different ministries? So you have Minister for Roads, you have Minister for Aviation, Minister for Rails, Minister for... And for me, that in itself is very inefficient. And one of the proposals in the GTP is to consolidate all the infrastructure-related ministries, where you appoint one minister for infrastructure, and then you can have one or two deputies to deal with different or specific infrastructure areas. Now, there's an added advantage in doing this consolidation, because for planning purposes, if, for example, you, as Minister for Infrastructure, you are committed to building a road from point A to point B, then you determine whether it is necessary to also build a rail line aligned to the road. So these are multimodal, what we call multimodal means of transport. And for planning purposes and even managing infrastructure, it makes a lot of sense if you have one man planning and coordinating the execution of infrastructure projects. Of course, there are one or two you may wish to isolate. For example, energy, because energy is It's also infrastructure, but that is a big one, and it's fundamental to the work of the economy. So in our proposal, that one is isolated. All the other ones are consolidated.
So you want to review and implement a new model for privatizing some state-owned enterprises. Why is that?
Yes, Kwame, we have a situation in this country where we have viable SOEs that are making money. Yes, they are making money, but compared to the potential that they have, I would say that they are underperforming. And the governance architecture in some of these SOEs clearly point to the fact that there's the need for management overhaul. And the only way to do this is to offload part of the shareholding to the private sector.
Right.
Directly or indirectly through the stock exchange. Because what that would do, particularly for those SOEs that are viable, is that it will provide an avenue for the recapitalization of these SOEs to bring in greater efficiency in the management and operations of these SOEs, and then also introduce more transparency and accountability. You'll be amazed that some of the SOEs that are on our books now are spending more money than even parent ministries that they are supposed to report to. The perks, the compensation for the leadership of some of these SOEs, you cannot even phantom that, even compared to ministers who are supposed to supervise them. So how does this make sense? But if you offload a significant part of the shareholding to the private sector, then it will bring in more money and then also make it more efficient in terms of their management. So this, it's a complete departure from all that has been happening in the past, where government keeps on holding on to
buy the state-owned enterprise. So how do we make sure that we operate such that people will not take advantage, of that for their own benefit?
First, if there's strong oversight over the operations of these companies, it ought not to be possible for a chief executive to deliberately run a company down. If there's strong oversight, as the Americans will say, it ain't gonna happen. That's the first thing.
Right.
But secondly, also, if in the event that a particular CEO is deliberately running down an SOE only with a view to turn around to bring in investors to buy into that company, then the issue of accountability in government contracting would then deal with that, as we've already discussed. Yes, you may have your own way of collapsing a company so that you can buy it later on. But then if the government contracting process has been sanitized, as we are proposing would do, then if you run it down, you may not automatically have the opportunity to buy it off. And so it will to be counterproductive.
Right. Public sector reforms obviously are very important to addressing the governance issue that we're talking about. But also there's a symbiotic relationship between that and constitutional reform. So, I mean, in order to achieve that, there should be that, idea of reforming the constitution. And now we are going into constitutional reforms. What, in your estimation, are the specific things that we ought to look at in respect of our constitution that, ought to be reformed so that we'll be able to achieve all the things that you are talking about? Because when you look at our constitution, on the face of it, it looks good, it looks clean. So why do you think that we need constitutional reform?
Yeah, we need constitutional reforms for a number of reasons. One, as you've pointed out, if you look at the public sector, the management and operations of the public sector, there are obviously certain deficiencies which can be cured only by constitutional reform. Because the public sector primarily is a creation of legislation. And that's why it's the public sector. And for most public sector agencies and institutions, there are legal frameworks that establish the public sector institutions and by extension also guide their management and operations. So if you want to really have an efficient reform process of the public sector, you cannot do that without amending the constitution. And so that's only one aspect of constitutional reform.
All right.
But there are also other aspects of constitutional reform that have nothing to do with the running and operations of the existing public sector institutions. So, for example, the specific reforms, constitutional reforms that are being proposed, starts with abolishing Article 71.
Okay.
Article 71, as I'm sure you are aware, identifies certain public sector portfolios or positions that are supposed, our officials who are supposed now to be paid compensation, salaries, other forms of emoluments as a separate category of public officers, separate from all other public servants. So members of parliament, for example, are supposed to be Article 71 holders, ministers, and various other. Now, the challenge, and I think this is what the general public has been complaining about, the challenge is that on what basis do you ring fence a certain number of public office holders, put them into one category, get the president to appoint an independent committee, an ad hoc committee, to be the ones who determine by making recommendations for the approval of the president in respect of their compensation. There's no fairness, there's no balance in that architecture. So the GTP is proposing specifically that Article 71 office, or the Article 71 itself, be abolished. And I will just read, it says, and then empower the Fair Wages and Salaries Commission, which is an existing commission, to determine the salaries of those public officials who previously were catered for under Article 71. So, yes, you have a section of the public sector coming under the Fair Wages Commission. Now, we are saying that bring the other public officers under 71, bring them all to the Fair Wages and Salaries Commission, and rather empower the commission to be able now to determine the salaries compensation for all public sector officers. It doesn't mean, this is not to suggest that every, let's say, a minister or an MP should have the same salary as a civil servant who is an administrative officer. That's not the issue. There will always be different categories of officers, but it is the mode of determining their compensation. This is what has created a challenge.
Okay, so you've dealt with two of them. We'll come back after this break and then address the other aspects of the constitutional reform. Stay with us. Alan Speaks here on Pan-African Television.
I say, you be who know me who be away. I say, dear cause of the so when I say, be the quest of baby you may. I say, the ref is a bit dry. I say, Alan Cash. I say, in this car is upon wine. I say, and the car I say, that's a blue caliber. I say, never pie balu. I say, my hand in the bride. I say, everything I do. I say, before shine your eye. I say, before you shine your shoe. I say, go I won't nine it. I say, you want to work on boo. I say, hey, I say, I say, Punjai I say, I say, I come like Alan Cash. Alan Cash, plenty money for my bank. I say, for my bank. I say, I say, I say, Punjai I say, I say, I come like Alan Cash.
Welcome back. So we are dealing with constitutional review under the Great Transformational Plan, specifically under the cluster of governance. And listen, we have dealt with two of the items: abolishment of Article 71, and you know what that means for incoming politicians, and the fact that after the abolishment of it, the empowerment of Fair Wages and Salary Commission to take over that mandate to ensure that there's a fair and equitable distribution of the resources. And Honorable Alan explained that that is not to say that a member of parliament should earn the same salary as an administrative officer and things like that. So there's going to be a plan to it. But also, you want to amend Article 191 to enable... okay, I think you've explained that.
Yes.
Fair Wages and Salaries Commission to determine But you want to amend Article 78, which is an interim provision, to enable the president to appoint ministers without limitation from any source, including from Parliament. Hey, is it possible?
Article 78 of the Constitution requires the president to appoint at least 50%
from Parliament
of his ministers from Parliament.
Okay.
Now, the logic underpinning that provision by the framers of the Constitution was that it will allow the executive or government then to have a voice in Parliament in order to defend government programs and activities. Whilst that may be a legitimate desire, the challenge that comes with that is that it means that the oversight responsibility of Parliament in checking government excesses or executive excesses, that is compromised, because if your own ministers who are part of the executive are also the ones in Parliament who are going to sit as judges in their own cause, then that whole regime of checks and balances is compromised. And be that as it may, it's also an ineffective and inefficient way of running the government machinery, because you cannot be an efficient and effective minister when half of the time you're supposed to be sitting in Parliament. We should not be looking at other jurisdictions and their own model and just copying it blindly. So what the GTP is saying is that under an Allen presidency, there will be a move to amend this provision, albeit the fact that it is an entrenched provision. And being an entrenched provision, it means that you have to go through a referendum,
yeah.
a very complicated process.
Yeah.
But it is worth going through that process.
But don't you think that, you know, the Constitution is wise enough to have made it an entrenched provision?
Well,
because maybe there are some explicable reasons why the Constitution decided to do.
Well, remember I was explaining I was explaining that the logic was that it will help government explain
its policies in Parliament.
In Parliament,
Yeah.
but by the same token, it means that you are dominating Parliament with people who have an interest in what comes from the executive. That means that you are compromising the oversight responsibility
Right.
of Parliament.
Okay.
Because the checks and balances that underpins this whole
Rule of law,
democracy and rule of law, then is constrained
Undermined.
and it's undermined. So
I understand what you're saying.
yeah.
So that you're saying that parliamentarians should represent their people
Yes.
fully and properly.
Yes.
Executive, do your job.
do your job,
Uh-huh.
and then when you bring your programs,
We scrutinize it.
you scrutinize,
Yeah.
and then that's what checks and balances is about. But again, there's some other interesting
Yeah, you want to abolish
proposals.
Articles 89 to 92 under Chapter 9 of the Constitution, which establishes the Council of State and provides for its functions. You don't need a Council of State?
The Council of State, as is constituted now,
Yes.
has become
Political.
very political.
Yes, political.
Very political. And although you have very celebrated and very experienced members of the Council of State, the structure and the architecture for exercising their functions makes it almost totally ineffective. You know, and it makes it almost impossible for them really to give counsel to the president in a way that is not compromised. And in lieu of this, the GTP is proposing the establishment of a second chamber.
Yeah.
And it is this second chamber that will now become the appointment body, or you can say the oversight.
Yeah,
They'll provide the oversight.
Approval process of appointments to independent constitutional bodies.
Yes.
And review budgets of ICBs and the arms of state for approval by Parliament.
So, for example, why should the president be the appointing authority for the electoral commissioner?
Indeed. It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
You know. So, under this new provisions, it would now make it possible for the second chamber, which is made up of a broad representation of different stakeholders who are also important in making our governance work. People from the labor unions, from the traditional authorities, from business, from academia, all the different stakeholder groups are represented in the second chamber. And in this particular case, unlike the Council of State, it means that you would have people from different political persuasions in there. So it is not possible for a president to control all of them. And that is the new model that is being proposed.
I want us to run through them quickly. You want to amend Article 70, which is an entrenched provision. Okay, I think on the appointment of heads of independent constitutional bodies, ICBs.
That's what I was referring.
You've just explained, right? Yeah. But you also want to amend Articles 190, 195, 202, 207, 212, and 232, subclause 2, which are non-entrenched, relating to the appointment and tenure of specific heads of independent constitutional bodies to conform to the provisions in the legislation establishing the second chamber. Okay, I think you've explained that.
You've explained that one, yes.
You want to amend Articles 2576 to establish traditional authorities as co-trustees with the president in respect of all mineral rights in Ghana. Are you not scared?
Kwame.
I'm scared of some of the chiefs.
you have traditional authorities who, by definition, are custodians of the assets of any traditional area on behalf of the people.
Indeed.
Then you have the Constitution also giving the same custodial responsibility and authority over land and mineral resource to the president. Now, in a situation where the president delegates his authority to a civil servant, let's say a public servant, like the Minerals Commission and its officials, to determine who can have right over mineral resources in a traditional area. That obviously, it's a very difficult situation to appreciate, because it does mean that if you have land and you actually build upon that land, and through prospecting or whatever means, it is found that there's gold under your building, the Minerals Commission has the right now to lease your land for prospecting to a third party. It means you don't have control over the land that you've built your house on. And it makes it almost impossible to have sanity in the administration of land as far as mineral rights are concerned. The president is the trustee on behalf of the people. He delegates that to Minerals Commission, and Minerals Commission can decide to give who they want. They can give the license to anyone without the approval of the traditional custodians of the land. So we are not saying that they should take it over completely. We are saying that they should be co-trustees.
Okay, I understand.
Of mineral rights.
You do know that decentralization is a proper vehicle for the purposes of ensuring proper governance.
Yes.
And you want to amend some articles in the Constitution to allow for MMDCs to operate freely and push the decentralization agenda. Others are calling for the election of some of these MMDCs and DCs and things like that. So what is the plan?
Well, the plan is very simple, as you read from the GTP, that the Article 243 should be amended to enable the election of MMDCs and also amend all other consequential provisions. This has been on the drawing board for a very long time. And it is designed to introduce efficiency, commitment into this whole local governance regime, and bring people who are respected by the citizens of any particular district. But if you go through an election, like every other election, that they would determine who is the right person to have oversight and to superintend over the affairs of the district. For me, it makes a lot of sense.
Is it not another form of, federalism? Having a federal state, like a federal state.
In a sense, another form.
Yeah.
Another form. But what it does is that the people will determine who
their leader is.
Their leader, yes.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. So let's look at the implementation plan, because I wanted to speak about the STRAJ and then the establishment of anti-corruption czar, but you have explained that already, so I don't want us to regurgitate that. So let's look at the implementation plan. If you have.
The implementation plan, a lot of people have been worried that we've had these constitutional reform proposals moving from one government to the other, and we still don't have traction in terms of execution and implementation. So what the GTP is proposing is that we have a clear implementation structure, which would ensure that the reforms that have been kind of going round from government to government finally gets a resting place in our body politic. And that is why this implementation plan has been proposed.
Okay. We have looked at the executive, we've looked at the legislature, and I think it's important to look at the judiciary.
Yes.
Can you take us through how you intend to reform the judiciary, particularly because of the kind of perception we have as Ghanaians about the judiciary, and the lack of confidence thereof?
Well, just 2 quick points.
Yes.
First is about introducing legislation to cap the number of Supreme Court justices. In many countries, in more mature democracies, there is always a threshold beyond which the president cannot go. And to have a wholesale provision that allows any number of justices to be appointed to the is in itself quite a slippery path, for our democracy. So yes, once a threshold is established, then we have a target, and that places a limitation on the president not being given the flexibility and authority to decide on any number of justices that he can appoint to the Supreme Court. So basically that, but also the reform that we are proposing includes enhancing the level of infrastructure that supports the work of the judiciary. Because that's a major constraint to efficiency.
Yeah. But before we proceed on that, I just want you to quickly respond to the statement that was put out by the Chief Justice in relation to this conversation, where she explains that the job is quite tiring, and oftentimes they are unable to sit, as frequently as they would wish. And so that is why it has become important that they appoint a lot more people. In fact, she made suggestions to the president, for the appointment of some justices. Do you find that excuse logical, reasonable?
I would rather propose that we do a comprehensive audit of the workload at the different levels of our Superior Court of Judicature.
Okay.
Because there's a hierarchy. It may really be that the challenge is not with the numbers in the Supreme Court. It may be at the lower levels, maybe at the High Court level or the Appeal Court. Because technically speaking, the Supreme Court has a limited responsibility under the Constitution. Indeed. In terms of what So the original decision of the Supreme Court cannot be
a general jurisdiction.
It cannot just be absolutely. And that's where I feel that having a blanket, I would say, opening for any number of justices can generate a negative effect. And so the starting point will be to, yes, indeed, it may be right that we need more judges, but we need to interrogate at what level these justices are required. And then we keep the sanctity of the Supreme Court, which is the highest body in the hierarchy of the judiciary, and not necessarily to limit it just for purposes of limitation, but to ensure that it does not become a wholesale opportunity for any president to appoint whoever they wish to put in the Supreme Court.
Okay. Let's look at. I think we've done
we've done the local government.
Let's look at chieftaincy.
Chieftaincy to some extent.
You married that.
Yes. That we need to be able to amend the Constitution to enable traditional authorities to participate more actively in our local governance structure, because our chiefs have been part of that governance architecture before independence. And since independence, it's unfortunate that we are not taking advantage of the stability of the institutions of chieftaincy to support local governance and administration. Because in every village there's a chief. Right down to the paramounts.
National security and defense optimization.
Well,
people have serious issues because they think that the national security as a body should should not be a political body.
Yes.
But right now, what we've seen is that it is more like an appendage of the executive, always doing the bidding of the executive and things like that without necessarily focusing on their core mandate. So how will you ensure that there's some sanity brought into that space and partisan politics eschewed from it?
I think the more troubling part of the national security apparatus and machine that we have now is not just the politicization in terms of who goes into the national security apparatus, but also the fact that our defense mechanisms and our defense architecture and structure, I feel, is not adequate to respond to emerging threats, particularly within
the sub-region.
The sub-region. So yes, there are challenges with the over-politicization of the national security apparatus. One could argue that, well, it's part of government. It's not independent of government. However, I think the over-politicization has been going on from one government to the other. It's not just a question of one government. It's been literally a part of what has been happening with all governments since our Fourth Republic. But I'm saying that beyond reducing this over-politicization and limiting it and building it as a professional government machinery, that should be the focus. Building it as a professional machinery, government machinery. Beyond that need, there's also the need to build the capacity of our national defense force. And that is why we've proposed, you recall we discussed this.
Absolutely. So when I said I was going to go
establish a national reserve force, a national reserve force, which would provide additional support in terms of combat operations in the event of any security threat. And there's the young people who come out of school who would opt to go to the military for 1 year would then join the National Reserve Force.
Media,
very powerful.
Media,
you'll be part of it. And I have a special attraction to the media for a number of reasons, because I believe that they ultimately determine whether a government works or does not work.
Absolutely.
Because by definition, they're supposed to inform, educate and entertain. And if they are doing it professionally, they can become a major vehicle, an instrument for deepening our democracy. But of course, as I've said, the media is constrained because the private media, which ought to be I would say the foundation of the media space, not government media. Unfortunately, they are financially handicapped, and sometimes that makes them susceptible to influence.
It's true.
by government, particularly the executive. So what this proposal is saying is that government or another presidency will provide incentives to private sector media organizations to enhance and modernize their operations. It's about modernization. And that includes also improving the compensation and the welfare and the well-being of media personnel.
Economic governance, social governance. Two very critical aspects of governance that I want you to just briefly touch on before we look at then that will be the final.
Okay. Well, very quickly, it says that review the structure and operations of all public investment vehicles. And when we talk about public investment vehicles, these are funds that have been created by government to support investment activities of the nation. So it's different from the statutory funds. These are public investment funds.
Okay.
And there are so many of them. So you have the Minerals Income Investment Fund, you have the Ghana Infrastructure Fund, you have the Development Bank of Ghana. What this proposal is saying is that it will be useful to consolidate all these investment funds into a Ghana Sovereign Wealth Fund. Now, Ghana Sovereign Wealth Fund then becomes the fund that puts all government wealth, under one vehicle, and then we can have greater oversight and transparency in how we deploy funds from that sovereign fund.
Finally, let's look at your diplomatic and international relations. Others will call it, your foreign policy.
Yeah. Well, I've said it over and over and over again.
Right.
That Ghana's foreign policy must be anchored on two things.
Okay.
First, on positive neutrality.
I like that.
Positive neutrality based on the strategic interests of Ghana. And that is self-explanatory. And secondly, also to focus more on commercial and economic diplomacy. Not by word, but indeed.
Right. Ladies and gentlemen, the leader of the movement for change, Honorable Alan Kwadwo Kyerematen on Alan Speaks. I want to believe that it's been very, very insightful and educative. Now you actually understand the policies that he intends to introduce when he gets the opportunity to lead the country. We are still explaining in great detail the policies that he has relative to the great transformational plan. And next week we're going to bring you yet another edition of Alan Speaks with me, Kwame Owusu-Daso. Keep watching Alan Speaks, because here is where we give you a better understanding of the policies of Honorable Alan Kwadwo Kyerematen. And he's not just explaining, putting out the policy, also explaining to you how he intends to execute them. I'll see you next week. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Truly African.